The golden glow of the chandelier lights reflected off the polished marble floors, casting a warm and expensive haze over the banquet hall. It was the kind of night where the air smelled of expensive perfume, old money, and the faint hint of awe, d'oeuvres being carried around on silver trays. This was the biggest fundraising event of the year for the university, a place where the smartest people in the country gathered to pat each other on the back and talk about how much they were changing the world. Professor Julian Holloway stood near the center of the room, holding a glass of champagne that he hadn't taken a sip of in 20 minutes. He was in his element. He was a man who had worked hard to get where he was, climbing the ladder of the academic world with a sharp mind and an even sharper ego. At 45 years old, Julian had tenure, a list of published papers longer than his arm, and a reputation for being a genius. He liked the way people looked at him when he entered a room, a mix of respect and a little bit of fear. He enjoyed the feeling of being the smartest person in the room, and tonight, he felt he certainly was. He was dressed in a tailor-made tuxedo that fit him perfectly, hugging his shoulders in a way that made him look powerful and in control. Around him, a small group of younger graduate students had gathered. They hung on his every word, laughing at his jokes and nodding enthusiastically whenever he paused for breath. Julian loved this audience. They were eager, impressionable, and they didn't yet know that being a professor was sometimes just about pretending you knew all the answers. You see, Julian said, his voice smooth and projecting just loud enough for people nearby to hear. The problem with the current curriculum is that we coddle these undergraduates. They want the easy answer. They want the formula that solves everything. But real science? Real physics? It is messy. It is chaotic. And it is not for the faint of heart. He took a pause, letting the words sink in, enjoying the wide-eyed looks of the students. If they cannot handle the heat of the lecture hall, they have no business in the laboratory. It is survival of the fittest, is it not? One of the students, a young man with messy hair and thick glasses, nodded vigorously. Exactly, Professor. That is why your lectures are so intense. They really separate the serious students from the rest. Julian smiled, a thin, satisfied smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He patted the student on the shoulder. Precisely. We are building the future here, gentlemen. We are not running a daycare. As the conversation continued, Julian's eyes wandered around the room, scanning the crowd. He liked to categorize people. There were the donors, the wealthy men and women, who wrote checks to get their names on buildings but didn't know a quark from a quart of milk. There were the administrators, the suits who worried about budgets and alumni relations. And then there were the intellectuals. His people, or so he thought. His gaze drifted toward the entrance of the hall, and his eyebrows furrowed slightly. Standing just inside the doorway was a woman who looked like she had walked into the wrong building by mistake. She was perhaps in her late 70s or early 80s, with a face full of deep wrinkles that told a story of a long life. Her hair was white and thin, pulled back in a simple, no-nonsense bun. She was dressed in a way that screamed ordinary. She wore a faded cardigan that looked like it had been knitted years ago, maybe even by her own hands, and a long, plain skirt that reached her ankles. On her feet were sensible black walking shoes, the kind you wear for comfort, not for fashion. In her hand, she held a small, worn-out purse that clutched tightly against her chest. Julian watched her for a moment. She wasn't talking to anyone. She wasn't heading toward the bar or the food tables. Instead, she was standing perfectly still, looking around the room with eyes that were sharp and clear, taking everything in. She didn't look confused, though. She looked interested, as if she were studying the room itself. Who is that? Julian wondered to himself. It was a private event. The guest list was strictly controlled. Security was supposed to keep out anyone who didn't belong. He assumed she must be a resident from the town nearby. Maybe someone who had seen the lights and wandered in, thinking it was an open house or a community gathering to Julian. The university was a fortress of intellect. It was a place for the elite. Seeing someone so common, standing in the middle of his sanctuary, annoyed him. It felt like a smear on a pristine painting. He felt a familiar itch in his chest. The urge to assert his dominance and protect the prestige of the event. He excused himself from the group of students. "Gentlemen, if you will excuse me for a moment, I see a situation that requires attention." He walked through the crowd, moving with the confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. People stepped aside to let him pass, nodding greetings as he went. Julian barely acknowledged them. His eyes were locked on the old woman near the door. As he got closer, he noticed details he hadn't seen from across the room. Her posture was straight, her shoulders back, despite her age. She didn't have the frail look of many people her age. She looked sturdy, like an old oak tree that has weathered 100 storms. She was looking at a large abstract painting on the wall, tilting her head slightly to the side. Analyzing the brushstrokes, Julian stopped right in front of her, blocking her view of the painting. "Good evening," he said. His tone was polite, but the coldness underneath was unmistakable. It was the voice people use when they are talking to someone they think is beneath them. The old woman turned her head slowly. She looked up at him. Her eyes were a piercing blue, and there was no fear in them. She didn't look startled or intimidated. She just looked at him, waiting for him to speak. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was steady and had a strange, calming quality to it. Julian smiled, a tight, mocking smile. He wanted to make sure she understood that she didn't belong here. "I was about to ask you the same question, my good woman. You seem to be a bit lost." "I am not lost," she replied simply. "I am exactly where I intended to be." Julian chuckled softly, a sound meant to belittle her. He crossed his arms over his chest. "Really? Because this is a private fundraising gala for the university's Department of Physics? The ticket price is rather steep, and the guest list is exclusive. It is a gathering for the academic community, for those who support the sciences." He took a step closer, leaning in slightly. He wanted to be intimidating. He wanted her to feel small. "We are here to celebrate the future of science," he continued, gesturing vaguely around the room. "This is not really the place for it. Well, for casual sightseeing. I believe the town library is open until 8 on Thursdays. Or perhaps there is a bingo game down the street." A few people standing nearby turned to look. Julian knew they were watching. He knew his students were watching. He was playing to his audience. He wanted them to see him handling this intruder with wit and authority. The old woman didn't blink. She didn't look embarrassed. She didn't look like she wanted to run away. Instead, she looked at Julian with a mixture of curiosity and pity, which only made him angrier. "I am not here for the library," she said calmly, "and I do not play bingo." "Then what could you possibly have to gain by standing in a room full of quantum physicists and donors?" Julian asked, his voice rising just a notch. He was losing patience with her lack of submission. He wanted her to apologize and leave. He wanted to prove to everyone that he was the gatekeeper of this world. "I am here to look," she said. "To look." Julian laughed, throwing his head back slightly. "To look at what? The pretty lights? The rich people eating fancy food? Be honest, you just wandered in off the street, didn't you? You saw the open door and thought you'd grab a free drink or some appetizers?" "I did not come for food," she said, her voice firming up just a fraction. Julian narrowed his eyes. He didn't like her tone. She was acting like she had a right to be here. He decided to hit her with the one thing he knew she couldn't fight back against. He would use his intelligence. He would use the language of his world to show her how out of depth she was. "Look, I do not want to be rude," Julian lied. "But you have to understand, we are discussing matters of great importance here. Matters of the universe. Theoretical constructs that govern reality itself." Paused for effect. "I am a professor of theoretical physics. I spend my days dealing with concepts that would make your head spin. This is not a place for idle chatter." The woman looked at him, her blue eyes unblinking. "Is that so?" "Yes, it is so," Julian said, puffing out his chest. "We talk about things like quantum entanglement, thermodynamics, the curvature of space-time, things that require decades of study to even begin to understand. You can't just walk in off the street and understand what is being said here. It would be like trying to read ancient Greek without ever learning the alphabet." He smirked, waiting for her to crumble. He expected her to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know," and then scurry away. He was ready to turn back to his students and share a laugh about the confused old lady, who thought she could hang out with the geniuses, but she didn't move. She stood her ground, clutching her old purse, looking at him as if he were a student who had just given a wrong answer on an exam. "You assume a great deal, young man," she said quietly. Julian felt a flash of irritation. "I assume what I can see. And I see a woman who is out of her depth. Do you even know what physics is?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She just looked at him. The air between them seemed to get heavy. The confidence that Julian felt just a moment ago began to waver, replaced by a strange sensation in his gut, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had made a terrible mistake. But he pushed the feeling down. He was Professor Holloway. He was the expert here. "I am waiting," Julian said, his voice tight. "Do you know what we do here?" The old woman finally spoke. "I know exactly what you do here," she said. "I also know that you made a mistake in your lecture last week regarding the second law of thermodynamics. It was a subtle error, but it was there." Julian froze. The smile vanished from his face. The blood drained from his cheeks. The silence that stretched between them was heavy. It's the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Julian felt like someone had just pulled the rug out from under him. He stood there, blinking rapidly, his mouth opening and closing slightly like a fish out of water. For a moment, he couldn't find the words. The champagne glass in his hand felt slippery, and he tightened his grip to stop it from falling. He stared at the old woman, trying to find a trace of mockery on her face, but there was none. She looked perfectly calm, as if she were merely commenting on the weather or asking for the time. But she had just dropped a bombshell. She had mentioned his lecture. She had mentioned the second law of thermodynamics. And worst of all, she had called him out on a mistake. "Excuse me?" Julian finally managed to stutter. His voice wasn't as smooth as before. It cracked a little, betraying his nervousness. The old woman didn't back down. She adjusted her cardigan, looking comfortable, while Julian felt like he was melting in his expensive tuxedo. "You heard me," she said softly. "Last Tuesday, you were discussing the application of entropy in closed systems. You tried to equate the heat death of the universe with the localized entropy of a black hole event horizon. It was a conceptual error. The two variables don't align the way you suggested. You confused the direction of the flow." Julian felt the blood rush back into his face, this time burning hot. A flush of red crept up his neck. He looked around frantically. The small group of graduate students he had been talking to earlier was now watching them with wide eyes. A few other guests had turned their heads, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't going the way Julian had planned. He was supposed to be the one embarrassing the intruder, not the other way around. He laughed, but it was a short, barking sound, defensive and loud. "Come now," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "This is ridiculous. You are telling me that you, a woman who clearly wandered in here from the street, know my lecture material better than I do? Do you even know what entropy is? It is a measure of disorder. It is not something you discuss in knitting class." "I do not knit," she replied simply. "And I didn't say I knew it better than you. I said you made a mistake. Even the best minds make mistakes. The problem isn't the error, Julian. The problem is the arrogance to not see it." Julian flinched when she used his first name. It felt too familiar coming from a stranger. It felt like a violation. He took a step closer, trying to use his height to intimidate her. He needed to shut this down. He needed to prove to everyone watching that this was just a crazy old lady saying nonsense. "You are speaking about things you do not understand," he hissed, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "You have probably read a headline in a newspaper or saw a pop science documentary on television. You picked up a buzzword, and you are using it to sound smart. It is pathetic, really, trying to act like you belong in a room full of intellectuals." He paused, looking at the students to make sure they were listening. She probably read about thermodynamics on a blog somewhere and thinks she is an expert now. This is the problem with the internet. Everyone thinks they are a scientist. The old woman didn't even blink. She looked at him with a gaze that felt older than the building itself. There was a depth in her eyes that unsettled him. She wasn't getting angry. She wasn't getting offended. She was just looking at him with a strange sort of pity which made Julian feel small. I do not read blogs, she said. And I do not own a television. I prefer primary sources. Your paper, the one you published in the Journal of Modern Physics last month? I read that as well. It was ambitious. But your mathematical foundation on the third page regarding quantum fluctuation was shaky. You relied on approximations that don't hold up under extreme variables. The room had gone completely quiet now. The chatter of the cocktail party had died down as people realized something serious was happening near the entrance. Even the students, who usually worshipped the ground Julian walked on, were exchanging confused glances. They knew the paper she was talking about. It was dense, complicated math that they struggled to understand. Yet this woman in the cardigan was discussing. It's like she was critiquing a grocery list. Julian's heart was hammering against his ribs. He felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. He was losing control of the narrative. He needed to regain the upper hand, and he needed to do it fast. Panic was starting to set in, but he masked it with aggression. Stop, he snapped, holding up his hand. Just stop. I have had enough of this nonsense. You are a fraud. You are some bored old woman who came here to cause trouble. You are mocking my life's work, and I will not stand for it. He turned to one of the security guards who was standing near the wall, looking uncertain about whether to intervene. Officer, Julian called out, this woman is trespassing. She is disrupting the event and harassing the guests. Please remove her. The security guard, a large man in a black suit, started walking toward them. Julian felt a surge of relief. He was going to win. He had the authority. He had the badge. Once the guard grabbed her arm, she would have to leave. He could turn back to his students and make a joke about how crazy people were attracted to universities, but the old woman didn't move. She didn't look at the guard. She kept her eyes locked on Julian. You are calling security because you are afraid, she said quietly. Her voice cut through the noise of the room. You are not afraid of me disrupting your party. You are afraid that I might be right. I am not afraid of a delusional crank. Julian shouted, losing his composure completely. I am a tenured professor. I have a PhD from MIT. Who are you? Nobody. You are nobody. The guard reached them, looking from Julian's red, furious face to the woman's calm one. Sir? The guard asked, hesitant. Is everything okay here? Of course, it is not okay. Julian pointed a shaking finger at the woman. She is impersonating a scholar. She is making a scene. Get her out! The old woman sighed, a sound of deep disappointment. She reached into her worn purse. Julian tensed, wondering if she was going to pull out a weapon, or maybe a stolen spoon. He took a half step back. But instead of a weapon, she pulled out a small, crinkled cocktail napkin and a pen with a chewed-up cap. If I leave, I will leave you with a gift, she said. She placed the napkin on the nearest high table and began to write. Her hand moved with surprising speed and precision. The scratching sound of the pen on the paper was the only sound in the immediate circle. What are you doing? Julian demanded, but he didn't stop her. He was mesmerized despite himself. She finished writing with a flourish and capped the pen. She picked up the napkin and held it out to him. You are struggling with the equation in Chapter 4 of your new book, she said. The one about the unification of field theory. You have been stuck on it for 6 months. I saw the draft on your desk when I walked by your office yesterday. Julian's eyes went wide. You were in my office? It was open, she said. It was messy. But I saw the equation. You are missing a variable. You are overcomplicating it. Here, she pushed the napkin into his chest. Julian looked down at it. It wasn't a phone number. It wasn't a scribble. It was a complex equation written in neat, sharp handwriting. It contained symbols he recognized instantly: integrals, matrices, tensors. It was a correction to the very problem that had been keeping him up at night for weeks. He stared at the napkin, his brain trying to process what he was seeing. It looked elegant. It looked simple. It looked right. This is impossible, he whispered. Mathematics is rarely impossible, Julian, she said softly. It is only waiting to be found. He looked up at her, his mouth open. For the first time in years, he didn't have a snappy comeback. He didn't have a witty insult. He felt like a child who had just been scolded by his grandmother, except this grandmother had just handed him the keys to the kingdom. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The aggression was gone. Now there was only fear and curiosity. The old woman smiled then. It was a small, sad smile. She didn't answer the question. Instead, she looked past him, toward the back of the room where the university officials were gathering. "I am just a guest," she said. "But you are making a scene." Before Julian could say another word, a deep voice boomed from behind him. "Is there a problem here?" Julian turned around to see the chancellor of the university walking toward them. The chancellor was a powerful man, not as Ellie impressed. Julian usually tried his best to be seen with him, but right now, the sight of the chancellor filled him with dread. The chancellor looked at Julian, then at the security guard, and finally, his eyes landed on the old woman. The change in the chancellor's face was instant. His expression went from annoyed to shocked. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening as he recognized the person standing in the shabby cardigan. "Good heavens," the chancellor breathed. "Dr. Vance?" Julian felt his stomach drop out of his body. He turned back to look at the woman. Dr. Vance. The name rang a bell, distant and faint, like a memory from a history book. "Hello, Richard," the woman said to the chancellor, her voice warm. "I see the parties haven't changed much. Still too much champagne and not enough food." Julian looked from the woman to the chancellor, his mind racing. The chancellor knew her? The chancellor was treating her with respect. Julian looked back at the napkin in his hand, then up at her face. The realization hit him like a bucket of ice water. He had tried to humiliate a guest. He had tried to kick out someone the chancellor knew personally, but he didn't know the half of it yet. He stood there holding a napkin that might have just saved his career, realizing that the nobody he had tried to destroy was about to become the most important person in the room. The silence that followed the chancellor's words was heavy, pressing down on Julian's shoulders like a physical weight. He felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him feeling cold and clammy. The room, which had been buzzing with low-level chatter just moments ago, had gone deathly quiet. All eyes were fixed on the small group near the entrance. Julian's brain was scrambling to catch up. He looked at the chancellor, a man usually composed and stern, who now looked like a schoolboy who had just been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Then he looked at the old woman, Eleanor. The chancellor had called her Dr. Vance. He racked his brain. Searching through the files of his memory, Dr. Eleanor Vance. The name sounded familiar, but it didn't fit the woman standing in front of him. He was expecting a colleague, a rival professor, maybe someone from a different university. But this woman, she looked like she should be baking cookies in a quiet cottage, not discussing advanced physics with the head of the university. "I don't understand," Julian stammered, his voice weak. He looked back at Eleanor, trying to find some sign that this was a prank, that she was an actress hired by the students to play a trick on him. But she was standing there, calm and collected, holding her worn purse with a dignity that made his expensive tuxedo feel like a costume. "You don't need to understand right now." "Julian," the chancellor said, his voice sharp. He stepped forward, completely ignoring Julian, and extended a hand toward Eleanor. "Dr. Vance, it is an honor to have you here. We had no idea you were in town. If we had known, we would have rolled out the red carpet, not this." Eleanor took the chancellor's hand and gave it a firm shake. "I prefer to travel quietly these days, Richard. No red carpets are necessary. I just wanted to see how the old place was doing." Julian stood there, forgotten for the moment. He looked down at the napkin still clutched in his hand. The ink was starting to smudge slightly where his thumb was pressing against it. He looked at the equation again. It was complex, elegant, and terrifyingly accurate. Suddenly, a memory clicked into place in his mind like a missing puzzle piece. He remembered a photo he had seen in a dusty history book during his first year of graduate school. It was a black and white picture of a group of scientists from the 1950s. In the center, standing next to Albert Einstein and J. Robert Oppenheimer, was a young woman with sharp eyes and a confident smile. The caption had read, "Dr. Eleanor Vance, the architect of modern quantum theory." Julian's knees felt weak. He wasn't just dealing with a donor. He wasn't dealing with a rival. He had just tried to kick out a living legend. This was the woman who had literally written the book on the subject he taught. She was the reason he had a job. Wait, Julian said, his voice cracking. Vance. As in, the Vance equations? The uncertainty principle modifications. Eleanor turned her head slowly to look at him. There was no anger in her eyes, only a mild curiosity. You know your history, at least. That is good. Many young professors these days are so focused on the future that they forget where they came from. Julian swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. He looked at his students, who were standing a few feet away with their mouths hanging open. He saw the realization dawning on their faces, too. They were smart kids. They knew the name Vance. They were looking at Julian not with admiration anymore, but with something else. Pity and shock. I didn't know, Julian whispered. I thought you were a guest. I am a guest, Eleanor corrected him gently. But I am also a scientist. Or at least, I used to be. The Chancellor cleared his throat, shooting a dangerous glare at Julian. Professor Holloway, you were asking security to remove Dr. Vance? Is that correct? Julian opened his mouth to lie, to make up an excuse, but the words died in his throat. The security guard was still standing there, looking uncomfortable. She was looking at the art, Julian tried to explain, knowing how pathetic it sounded. I didn't think she was part of the event, because she didn't look the part, the Chancellor asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Because she wasn't wearing a designer gown? Because she is old? Julian, I am disappointed. We teach our students to look beneath the surface. I expect you to do the same. The humiliation was burning hot now. Julian felt his face turning red. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He wanted to run out of the room, but his feet felt glued to the marble floor. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Eleanor stepped in, sensing Julian's distress. She didn't want a scene. It is all right, Richard. Please, don't be hard on him. He made an honest mistake. I don't exactly look like a theoretical physicist anymore. The Chancellor took a deep breath, obviously trying to control his temper for her sake. You are right, Dr. Vance, you are too kind. But still, this is unacceptable. He turned back to the security guard. Please, go back to your post. Dr. Vance is not trespassing. She is our most honored guest. The guard nodded quickly and walked away, eager to escape the tension. Julian looked at the napkin again. His hands were shaking. He realized that this equation, scribbled on a piece of paper meant for a drink, was the solution to the problem that had been haunting him for months. It was the key to finishing his life's work. And she had just given it to him, right after he had treated her like trash. It is correct, Julian mumbled, staring at the paper. The math. It is correct. Eleanor looked at him. Of course it is correct. I didn't spend 40 years studying the universe to get my algebra wrong, how? Julian asked, looking up at her. How did you see the mistake in my paper so quickly? I have been working on that variable for months, because I made the same mistake when I was your age, she said simply. In 1954, I spent 6 months banging my head against the wall until a mentor pointed it out. You cannot force the universe to fit your equation, Julian. You have to let the equation describe the universe. The words hit Julian like a punch to the gut. He had always been so proud of his persistence, his stubbornness. He thought that refusing to give up was his greatest strength. But here was a woman telling him that his stubbornness was actually blinding him. He wasn't persevering. He was just being arrogant. Julian started, but he didn't know what to say. An apology seemed too small, too insignificant. Sorry, I tried to throw you out, didn't really cover it. When you were talking to a scientific icon, Eleanor reached out and gently patted his arm. The gesture was motherly, which made Julian feel even worse. Do not worry about it. Just promise me one thing. Anything, Julian said eagerly. He would have promised her his car, his house, anything to fix this moment. Next time you see an old woman in a cardigan, she said, her eyes twinkling just a little bit, don't assume she is lost. And maybe, just maybe, ask her what she thinks about the weather. You might be surprised. The Chancellor let out a short, nervous laugh. She has you there, Professor. Julian forced a smile, but it felt tight and fake. He felt like he had been stripped naked in front of everyone he respected. His ego, which he had spent years building up like a fortress, had been crumbled in 5 minutes by a little old lady with a pen. The Chancellor gestured toward the main hall. Dr. Vance, please let us move to the VIP lounge. I insist on buying you a drink. A real one, not the warm champagne they are serving out here. That sounds lovely, Eleanor said. Lead the way. She began to walk away with the Chancellor. For a second, Julian was left standing alone. The crowd parted to let them through, but eyes lingered on Julian. He could hear the whispers starting to spread through the room like a wave. Was that Eleanor Vance? I think it was. I can't believe Holloway didn't know. He tried to kick her out. What a fool. The whispers cut him deep. He knew his reputation was taking a hit tonight, and it would be a long time before people forgot this story. But as he watched her walk away, he looked down at the napkin one last time. He folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket, right next to his heart. He realized that this was the most important thing that had ever happened to him professionally. He had been humiliated, yes, but he had also been taught a lesson he would never forget. He tucked the napkin in, took a deep breath to steady his shaking hands, and prepared to face the rest of the night. He had a lot of apologizing to do, and a lot of math to relearn. The walk toward the VIP lounge felt like the longest walk of Julian's life. Even though the Chancellor and Eleanor were walking ahead, and Julian was trailing a few steps behind, he could feel the heavy judgment of the crowd pressing against his back. The air in the main hall seemed to have changed. Earlier it had been filled with the buzz of admiration and intellectual gossip. Now it was thick with whispers. He didn't need to hear them to know what they were saying. Did you see that? That was Eleanor Vance. Holloway really messed up. I can't believe he tried to throw her out. Julian kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the polished marble floor. Every step felt like walking through mud. His expensive shoes, which he had polished so carefully that morning, suddenly felt like lead weights. The ego that had made him feel 10 feet tall an hour ago had completely evaporated, leaving him feeling small and exposed. He wasn't a celebrated professor anymore. He was the villain of the story. They reached a heavy mahogany door at the far end of the hall. The Chancellor opened it and ushered Eleanor inside. Julian followed, closing the door on the noise of the party. The VIP lounge was quieter, lined with leather armchairs and dark wood bookshelves. It was a room designed for serious conversation, stark contrast to the flashy light show of the gala outside. The Chancellor turned to Julian as soon as the door clicked shut. The mask of politeness he wore for the public dropped away. His face was red, and his eyes were flashing with anger. Julian, the Chancellor said, his voice low and trembling, do you have any idea what you have done tonight? Julian stood near the door, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. I made a mistake, sir. A terrible mistake. I didn't recognize her. I didn't know she was coming. That is not the point. The Chancellor raised his voice, then quickly lowered it. Remembering Eleanor was sitting in a chair nearby, watching them with a calm expression. The point is that you judged a human being by her appearance. You treated a guest legend like trash because she didn't fit your idea of what a scientist looks like. This is a university, Julian. We are supposed to be better than this. I know, Julian whispered. He felt sick to his stomach. I was arrogant. I was showing off for my students. The Chancellor let out a long, frustrated sigh and rubbed his temples. You have insulted one of the greatest minds this century has produced. Do you know how hard it was to get her to visit? We have been trying to get her to come back here for 10 years. She refuses to give lectures, she refuses awards, and tonight she finally walks in, and the first thing she gets is you trying to humiliate her. Julian couldn't look the Chancellor in the eye. He stared at a pattern in the Persian rug on the floor. I am so sorry, he said, and for the first time he meant it. There was no excuse, no witty comeback. He just felt the crushing weight of his own stupidity. Gentlemen. Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. It was soft but carried a strange authority. Please, stop shouting. There is no need for this. They both turned to look at her. She was sitting comfortably in one of the leather armchairs, looking around the room with a faint smile. She didn't look angry. She didn't look like she wanted revenge. She just looked tired. "He needs to understand the gravity of the situation," the Chancellor said, his voice still stern. "He understands," Eleanor said. She gestured toward Julian. "Look at him. He is shaking like a leaf. I think his ego has been deflated enough for one night." Julianne looked up. She was right. He was trembling. He felt like a child who had been scolded by the headmaster, but there was also a strange sense of relief. The act of being arrogant was exhausting. Keeping up the wall of superiority required so much energy. Now that the wall had been smashed, he felt surprisingly light. Even if the landing hurt, the Chancellor took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. "You are right, Dr. Vance. I apologize for the outburst. This is just highly irregular." "No harm done," Eleanor said. She turned her gaze to Julian. "Julian, come here." "Sit down." Julian hesitated. He felt like he should be standing, or kneeling, or doing penance. "I would rather stand, thank you." "Sit," she commanded gently. Julian walked over to the chair opposite her and sat on the edge of it. His back straight, ready to run if he had to. Eleanor leaned forward, her blue eyes piercing right through him. "Tell me, Julian, why did you become a physicist?" The question caught him off guard. He blinked. "I wanted to understand the universe. I wanted to know how things work. The elegance of the laws of nature. It always fascinated me." "And when did you decide that understanding was only for people who dress like you?" she asked. Julian flinched. The question hurt because it was true. "I don't know," he admitted. "I think I just got used to being the smartest person in the room. I started to associate intelligence with status. With the right degrees, the right job title, the right clothes." "It is a common trap," Eleanor said, nodding slowly. "When you work in a place like this, it is easy to get lost in the prestige. You start to believe that the letters after your name make you better than other people. But knowledge does not work that way. Truth is not reserved for the elite. The universe does not care if you are a professor or a farmer. The laws of physics apply to everyone equally." She reached out and touched the breast pocket of Julian's tuxedo where he had put the napkin. "You have a good mind, Julian. I could see that from your paper, despite the errors. But you are using your mind to build walls instead of bridges." Julian looked down at his hands. He felt tears stinging his eyes, which shocked him. He hadn't cried in years. He didn't think he had it in him. "I think I forgot why I started," he whispered. "I spent so much time trying to prove I was a genius that I stopped acting like a scientist." "A scientist is humble," Eleanor said. "A scientist is always a student. No matter how much you learn, there is always more. The moment you think you know everything is the moment you stop learning." The Chancellor, who had been standing by the window watching them, walked over and poured 3 glasses of water from a crystal decanter. He handed one to Eleanor and one to Julian. "Dr. Vance is right, Julian," the Chancellor said, his voice softening. "We hired you because you were brilliant, not because you were a bully. We need you to get back to being the scientist we thought you were." Julian took the glass and took a long drink. The cold water helped settle his nerves. He looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, and for the first time he didn't see an old woman in a cardigan. He saw a brilliant mind that had witnessed history. He saw the person who had laid the groundwork for everything he was now studying. "What do I do now?" Julian asked. The question was simple, but he meant it deeply. "How do I fix this?" Eleanor smiled, a genuine, warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You start by admitting you don't know everything. You take that napkin, you go back to your office, and you solve that equation properly. And then you start treating your students and everyone else you meet with respect. You teach them to be curious, not to be arrogant." She stood up slowly. Julian and the Chancellor immediately stood up as well. "I should be going," Eleanor said. "It is past my bedtime, and I have had enough excitement for one night." "No, please," the Chancellor started. "We can't let you leave like this. Let me drive you home." Eleanor shook her head. "I took a cab. I can take one back. I am quite independent, Richard." But at least let us walk you out, Julian said. The words came out before he could stop them. He wanted to walk her out. He felt a desperate need to show her and everyone else that he had some manners. Eleanor looked at him, raising an eyebrow. Are you sure? I wouldn't want to embarrass you in front of your guests. Julian's face flushed red, but he held her gaze. I am sure. It would be my honor. Eleanor nodded once. Very well. The three of them walked back toward the heavy door. Julian reached for the handle, and as he pulled it open, the noise of the gala rushed back in. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. But this time, the room felt different. As they walked out, the crowd didn't look at Julian with fear or jealousy. They were watching the old woman. Julian saw his graduate students standing in a huddle. They were whispering, but when they saw him, they went quiet. Julian didn't look away. He didn't put on his arrogant mask. He simply nodded to them, acknowledging their presence, and walked behind Eleanor and the Chancellor. He felt a strange sense of peace. He had been knocked down, but as they walked through the crowd, he realized he was finally standing on solid ground. As they walked back through the grand hall, the atmosphere shifted completely. It was like the parting of the Red Sea. The hush that fell over the room wasn't out of fear anymore. It was out of reverence. Julian could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes burning into his back. A few minutes ago, he would have relished this kind of attention, thinking they were all looking at him, the great Professor Holloway. Now he knew the truth. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at the small, unassuming woman walking 2 steps in front of him. They were craning their necks to get a glimpse of Dr. Eleanor Vance, the ghost of physics past, who had suddenly come to life. Julian felt like a security guard escorting a queen, and for the first time in his life, he was perfectly okay with playing a supporting role. They reached the grand entrance doors. The doorman, who had earlier looked at Eleanor with suspicion, now practically bowed as he opened the large glass doors for them. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of rain and asphalt. It was a sharp contrast to the perfumed air inside. Eleanor stopped on the top step of the stairs. A yellow cab was just pulling up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The Chancellor stepped forward, hovering anxiously. Are you sure you won't let us call a car service? The Chancellor asked for the 10th time. It is no trouble at all. Eleanor shook her head gently. Richard, really? I'm fine. I have taken cabs since before you were born. It is good for the soul. She turned to Julian. He stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, feeling very small. Julian, she said, double quotes. Yes, Dr. Vance. She reached out and patted his hand. It was a brief touch, but her skin was warm and dry. You have a napkin in your pocket. Don't lose it. And don't let your ego hide it away in a drawer. Use it. I will, Julian promised. I thank you. For the math. And for the lesson? There is no thanks necessary, she said, looking him in the eye. We are all just students, Julian. Some of us just have been in the classroom a little longer. She smiled, then turned and walked down the stairs. The cabbie got out to open the door for her, and she slid into the back seat with the ease of someone who has lived a full, uncomplicated life. The cab drove off into the night, its taillights fading into the dark street. Julian and the Chancellor stood on the steps for a moment, watching the empty road. The Chancellor let out a long breath, puffing out his cheeks. Well, the Chancellor said, turning to Julian, that was certainly unexpected. I messed up, Julian said bluntly. Badly. The Chancellor looked at him for a long moment. The anger was gone, replaced by a serious, contemplative look. You did, but you didn't run away when the truth came out. You didn't try to lie, and you walked her out. That counts for something, does it? Julian asked. Because I have a feeling my reputation is in tatters. Reputations are funny things, the Chancellor said, putting his hands in his pockets. Tomorrow, everyone will be talking about this. They will say, you tried to humiliate a legend. Some will laugh at you. Yes, that is true. But the ones who matter, the real scholars, they will remember that you were humbled. And if you go back to your office and solve that problem with the help she gave you, they will respect you for that. Nobody respects a man who pretends to know everything. Everyone respects a man who learns. Julian reached into his pocket and felt the crinkle of the napkin. It was still there. The answer to his problems was literally sitting in his breast pocket, written in blue ink on a piece of soft paper. "I need to go home," Julian said suddenly. "I need to work." The chancellor nodded. "Go enjoy the gala for me." "Actually, no. Go home. Just be smarter next time, Julian." "I will," Julian said. "Good night, sir." Julian walked down the stairs and found his own car in the VIP parking lot. As he drove home, the city lights blurred past his window. Usually after these events, his mind would be racing with gossip, thinking about who he impressed and who he insulted. Tonight, his mind was quiet. It was a strange feeling, like a calm sea after a storm. He got to his apartment. A sleek, modern place filled with expensive furniture and stacks of academic journals. He walked in and didn't even bother taking off his tie. He went straight to his desk, clearing away the clutter cans of soda, old notes. Empty coffee mugs until he had a clean space. He carefully pulled the napkin out of his pocket. It was slightly warm from his body heat. He smoothed it out on the desk, using his palm to flatten the wrinkles. He stared at the equation she had written. It was beautiful. It was simple. It was exactly the piece of the puzzle he had been missing for months. He grabbed a pen and a fresh sheet of paper. He started to write. For hours, he sat there, the only light in the room coming from his desk lamp. He didn't think about the humiliation at the party. He didn't think about the whispers. He just did what he loved. He did science. He followed the math where it led him, and this time, didn't try to force it to go where he wanted it to go. Around 4 a.m., he finally stopped writing. He rubbed his eyes, which were stinging with fatigue. He looked at his work. The paper was covered in equations, but they all flowed together perfectly. They made sense. The problem was solved. It was the best work he had done in years. He sat back in his chair and looked out the window at the pre-dawn, sky turning a pale gray. He thought about Eleanor. He wondered if she was awake, or if she was sleeping soundly in her quiet home. He realized he knew nothing about her life, her family, or her struggles. He had only seen the surface. He had judged her by her cardigan, while she was judging him by his character. He picked up the napkin again. He didn't want to throw it away. He found a frame he had bought years ago but never used. He slid the napkin into the frame and set it right next to his computer monitor. It was a crooked napkin in a fancy frame, but to Julian, it was a masterpiece. It was a reminder. A few days later, Julian walked into his lecture hall. It was the first class since the gala. The room was packed, but it was unusually quiet as he walked to the podium. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw his graduate students in the front row. He saw the looks in their eyes, expectant. Waiting to see if he was still the arrogant man from the party, Julian cleared his throat. He didn't start with his usual grand introduction. He didn't ask everyone to turn off their phones. "Last week," Julian said, his voice echoing in the large room, "I made a mistake. I met a person who I thought didn't belong here. I was wrong. The room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. I thought intelligence was about degrees and titles," Julian continued, looking at the students. "I learned that it is actually about curiosity and humility. The person I met taught me that even when you think you are the master, there is always something new to learn." Glancing at the framed napkin he had brought with him and placed on the podium, though nobody else knew what it was, so Julian said, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in a long time. "Let us start today's lesson, not as a professor and students, but as fellow students trying to figure out how the universe works." He saw a look of relief pass through the front row. The tension broke. Someone smiled. Julian picked up his chalk and turned to the blackboard. He wasn't the smartest man in the room anymore, and he realized finally that he never really was. And for the first time, he was perfectly okay with that. He began to write, and the chalk dust danced in the light, simple and pure, just like the truth.